Hiker rescues bear on a cliff. What happens next will leave you speechless. Logan Callahan adjusted the straps of his hiking backpack, taking a deep breath of the crisp mountain air as the trail ahead stretched like a narrow ribbon winding through the Montana wilderness. The early morning sunlight filtered through a canopy of towering pines, casting golden streaks upon the forest floor. This was exactly what he had come for: solitude, raw beauty, and a chance to escape the relentless pressures of his meticulously planned urban life. His well-worn camera hung securely around his neck, a constant companion in his quest to capture the soul of untamed landscapes. The journey to this point had not been exhausting in distance, but in decisions. The weight of corporate deadlines, empty conversations, and the nagging feeling of stagnation had driven him to seek something primal, something unfiltered. This was more than just a hike. It was a quiet rebellion against the life he had built. The trail climbed steadily, its uneven terrain punctuated by clusters of wildflowers and rocky outcroppings. Logan paused, captivated by a patch of fireweed bursting through a narrow crevice. The vibrant magenta blossoms stood defiant against the gray stone that framed them. Crouching low, he carefully angled his lens to capture the interplay of light and shadow. A small smile crossed his lips. This wasn't just a snapshot. It was a testament to resilience. That was what captivated him the most. The silent stories nature told, the persistence of life in the most unexpected places. Rising to his feet, he wiped the sweat from his brow and took a sip from his water bottle. The morning chill was already giving way to the warmth of the day. The forest, though still, was alive. Birds sang in overlapping melodies, and occasional rustles in the underbrush hinted at unseen creatures moving nearby. Just a few feet from the trail, a pair of deer grazed, their tawny coats blending seamlessly with the trees. Logan carefully raised his camera, ensuring not to startle them, and captured their delicate elegance before they bounded deeper into the woods. Moments like these grounded him, reminding him of his insignificance in the grand web of life. Nature was indifferent to human ambitions and failures. It simply existed. As the trail narrowed, the towering trees thinned out, revealing a breathtaking view of the valley below. Logan came to an abrupt stop, awestruck by the vast expanse before him. A sea of emerald green stretched endlessly, interrupted only by the sinuous curve of a river glinting under the sunlight. The distant peaks of the Rockies framed the horizon, their snow-capped summits shimmering like sentinels guarding an ancient world. For a long while, he simply stood there, absorbing the majesty of it all. He could almost feel his soul quieting, the ever-present hum of anxiety fading into profound stillness. Setting up his tripod, he meticulously framed the shot. As the shutter clicked, he thought, "This is it. This is what I came for." Continuing along the trail, Logan felt the weight of his backpack lighten as his body adjusted to its load, his boots crunching rhythmically against the dirt path. He had mapped out his route with precision, marking rest stops and potential campsites, yet a part of him relished the unknown. Montana's wilderness was unpredictable, a blend of serene beauty and raw danger. He had read countless accounts of hikers encountering bears, wildcats, and sudden storms, but none of it deterred him. It thrilled him. It was a reminder that he was leaving behind a world of safety and routine for one that demanded respect and adaptability. The sun was nearing its zenith when Logan reached a small clearing. He decided it was the perfect spot for a midday break. Shrugging off his pack, he lowered himself onto a fallen log, savoring the cool breeze that rustled through the grass. From one of the pockets, he retrieved a sandwich, its simple ingredients tasting like a feast after hours of trekking. He ate slowly, eyes scanning the trees as he imagined the creatures that might be watching him from the shadows. There was no sound of cars, no hum of distant machinery, only the symphony of rustling leaves and bird calls. He felt for the first time in months truly present. As the afternoon wore on, Logan noticed subtle shifts in the atmosphere. The light filtering through the trees grew softer, signaling the sun's slow descent. Shadows stretched across the trail, giving the forest an almost otherworldly glow. He quickened his pace, eager to reach a flat area he'd earmarked on his map as a potential campsite. The thought of a fire crackling beneath a blanket of stars filled him with anticipation. But as he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't entirely alone. Every so often, he would catch movement out of the corner of his eye, a flicker of shadows or the sway of branches that didn't match the wind. He paused, scanning his surroundings, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, the sensation lingered, an almost electric awareness prickling at the back of his neck. By the time Logan reached the campsite, the sky had begun its transformation into a canvas of deep purples and fiery oranges. He worked quickly, gathering wood and stacking stones into a makeshift fire pit. The warmth of the flames, once lit, pushed back the encroaching chill of the evening. Logan settled onto his sleeping bag, the firelight dancing across his face as he opened a small journal. He jotted down his thoughts, sketching a few rough outlines of the landscapes he had encountered that day. The rhythmic chirping of crickets joined the crackling fire, creating a lullaby that soothed his restless mind. Looking up, Logan was struck by the sheer density of stars scattered across the sky. It was a sight he hadn't seen in years, obscured by the light pollution of city life. He lay back, letting the vastness of the universe wash over him. Somewhere out there, countless lives were unfolding. Yet here, in the embrace of the wilderness, everything felt simpler, more connected. The stars, the trees, the river, they all seemed to hum with the same rhythm, as though whispering an ancient truth. Logan closed his eyes, the fire's warmth lulling him to sleep as the forest kept its silent vigil. The soft light of dawn seeped through the forest canopy as Logan Callahan stirred from his sleep, the crackling remnants of last night's fire now reduced to faintly glowing embers. The air was crisp, biting at his exposed face, and a thin layer of dew had settled on his gear. He stretched, his breath visible in the cool morning, and listened to the forest waking around him. Birdsong echoed through the trees, and the distant sound of running water hinted at a stream nearby. Logan sat up, shaking off the remnants of sleep, and began packing his things with the efficiency of someone well-versed in outdoor living. Every movement felt purposeful, a stark contrast to the aimless monotony he had left behind in the city. The day ahead promised discovery, and he intended to meet it head-on. After a quick breakfast of trail mix and coffee brewed over the embers, Logan strapped on his backpack and set out, following the trail that snaked deeper into the wilderness. The sun climbed slowly, its golden rays piercing the trees and dappling the forest floor with light. The earthy scent of moss and damp wood filled the air, grounding him in the present. As he walked, the familiar rhythm of his boots against the trail and the steady swing of his camera gave him comfort. He stopped occasionally to photograph intricate spiderwebs glistening with dew, the sunlight casting tiny rainbows in their delicate strands. Logan found himself drawn to the smallest details, marveling at how life thrived even in such rugged isolation. The forest seemed more alive than it had the previous day, the morning light revealing an intricate web of activity that Logan had overlooked before. A red squirrel chittered at him from a nearby branch, its tiny body quivering with nervous energy as it clutched an acorn. Overhead, a hawk soared in lazy circles, its sharp cry cutting through the stillness. Logan paused to capture the moment, angling his lens upward to frame the bird against the deep blue sky. He smiled as he reviewed the shot on his camera, a small victory that felt more rewarding than any professional accolade he'd ever received. The trail grew steeper as the morning stretched on, leading him toward a ridge he'd marked on his map as a potential vantage point. Logan's legs burned with the effort, but he relished the challenge, each step a reminder of his body's resilience. The faint sound of rushing water grew louder as he climbed, and he realized the stream he had heard earlier was much closer than he'd anticipated. The trail veered sharply, revealing a narrow path that wound toward the sound. Curious, Logan followed it, his anticipation growing with each step. The stream came into view suddenly, its crystal-clear waters cutting through a rocky bed, surrounded by ferns and wildflowers. Logan knelt by the edge, scooping a handful of the icy water to splash on his face. The chill was invigorating, sharpening his senses and clearing the last remnants of fatigue from his mind. He lingered for a moment, marveling at the pristine beauty of the spot, before setting up his camera to capture the interplay of water, light, and stone. As he adjusted the settings, he noticed a shadow moving in the periphery of his vision. Logan froze, his instincts on high alert. He scanned the opposite bank, his heart thudding in his chest. At first, there was nothing but the ripple of water and the sway of the underbrush in the breeze. Then he saw it, a small brown figure clinging precariously to a rocky ledge just above the stream. His breath caught in his throat as he realized it was a bear cub, its tiny claws scrabbling for purchase on the slick stone. The cub let out a sharp, plaintive cry that echoed through the forest, a sound so raw and desperate that Logan felt it in his core. He looked around quickly, scanning for any sign of the mother bear. The last thing he wanted was to find himself between her and her cub, but there was no movement, no sound beyond the cub's cries in the rush of the stream. Logan's first instinct was to stay put, to let nature take its course. But the sight of the cub's struggle gnawed at him. Its small body trembled with exertion, and its cries grew weaker, more frantic. He knew he couldn't just stand by. Carefully, he pulled off his pack and scanned the area for the safest way to cross the stream. The current was swift but not overpowering, and a series of rocks jutted out of the water, forming a crude path to the opposite side. Logan tested the first rock with his boot, his heart pounding as it wobbled slightly beneath his weight. He steadied himself and moved cautiously to the next, each step calculated and deliberate. When he reached the other side, Logan crouched low to avoid startling the cub. Its cries quieted slightly as it turned its small, frightened eyes toward him. The cub was even smaller up close, its fur matted and damp, its tiny claws gripping the rock in desperation. Logan spoke softly, his voice calm and steady. "Hey, little one," he murmured. "It's okay. I'm here to help." Slowly he extended his hand, careful not to make any sudden movements. The cub flinched at first but didn't retreat, its exhaustion overriding its instinct to flee. Logan inched closer, his knees scraping against the rough stone. Reaching out, he gently scooped the cub into his arms, cradling its trembling body against his chest. The cub let out a small whimper but didn't resist, its tiny frame limp with fatigue. Logan's relief was short-lived as he realized the precariousness of their position. Balancing the cub in one arm, he began the slow journey back across the rocks, his every muscle taut with focus. The current splashed against his boots, and the cub squirmed slightly, making his footing even more uncertain. But step by step, Logan made it to the other side, his heart racing as he set the cub down on the soft grass near the stream's edge. The cub stumbled slightly before collapsing into a heap, its tiny chest rising and falling with labored breaths. Logan knelt beside it, his hands trembling from adrenaline. He scanned the surrounding forest again, half expecting the mother bear to come crashing through the underbrush at any moment. Instead, the forest remained eerily still, as though holding its breath. Logan reached into his pack and pulled out a small towel, using it to dry the cub's damp fur. The cub blinked up at him, its dark eyes wide with a mixture of fear and trust. Just as Logan began to relax, a low growl rumbled from the trees behind him. His blood turned to ice as he turned slowly, coming face to face with the towering form of the mother bear. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her massive frame silhouetted against the dappled light filtering through the trees. Her eyes locked onto Logan, her growl deepening as she took a step closer. Logan froze, his mind racing. He held up his hands, palms out, and backed away slowly, his breath shallow and quick. The mother bear's gaze shifted to the cub, and her growl softened. She moved past Logan with deliberate steps, nuzzling the cub gently before lifting it in her powerful jaws. To Logan's astonishment, she turned back to him for a moment, her amber eyes meeting his with an expression that felt almost understanding. Then, without another sound, she disappeared into the forest, her cub safely in tow. Logan stood frozen, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. The forest seemed to exhale, the tension dissolving into the rustle of leaves and the babble of the stream. Logan let out a shaky breath and sank to the ground, his heart pounding as he stared at the spot where the bears had vanished. Whatever had drawn him to this wilderness, he realized, had led him here for a reason. The forest felt different in the aftermath of Logan's encounter with the bear. Though the same towering trees surrounded him, their rustling branches brushing against one another in the soft breeze, there was an unfamiliar stillness to the air. It wasn't silence exactly. Birds still chirped intermittently, and the nearby stream gurgled softly as it snaked through the rocks. But it was as if the woods were observing him now, waiting to see what he would do next. Logan adjusted the straps of his backpack and stood up, his legs trembling slightly from adrenaline. He glanced once more toward the spot where the mother bear had vanished, her cub cradled gently in her jaws, and let out a long, slow breath. The intensity of the encounter lingered in his chest, a mix of awe and disbelief. Part of him wanted to follow the bears, to ensure their safety, or simply to understand what had passed between them in those fleeting moments of connection. But the rational part of his mind, the one that understood the unpredictable nature of wild animals, urged him to keep moving. With a final glance over his shoulder, Logan turned back to the trail. The sun hung higher in the sky now, its golden light filtering through the dense canopy and casting intricate patterns on the forest floor. Logan resumed his hike, but his pace was slower, his thoughts tangled. The bear's gaze stayed with him, its amber intensity replaying in his mind like an unsolved riddle. He had been prepared for danger, expecting only fear or aggression, but what he'd seen in her eyes was neither. Instead, there had been something deeper, recognition, maybe even gratitude. The thought unsettled him as much as it comforted him. Was it possible for a wild animal to comprehend the kindness of a human? Or was he simply projecting his own need for meaning onto the encounter? He tightened his grip on his walking stick, shaking his head as if to clear it. Whatever the truth was, Logan knew one thing for certain. He would never forget that moment. As the trail ascended, the forest opened up to reveal a sweeping view of the valley below. Logan paused to take it in, leaning against a boulder as he caught his breath. The landscape stretched endlessly before him, rolling hills blanketed in evergreens, their dark green tops brushing against the pale blue of the sky. Farther in the distance, jagged peaks rose like ancient sentinels, their snow-dusted crests gleaming in the sunlight. The scene was stunning, but Logan's focus shifted quickly to the details closer to him. He scanned the area, his photographer's eye searching for signs of movement, for the flicker of an animal slipping through the underbrush, or the ripple of a bird's wing cutting through the air. Nothing stirred, but the quiet felt less empty now. It was as though the forest had noticed him, and for the first time, he felt like he was being included in its intricate rhythm. Logan adjusted the settings on his camera and snapped a few shots of the valley, the soft click of the shutter punctuating the stillness. As he framed a close-up of a lone tree perched on the edge of a cliff, he noticed something odd in the corner of his viewfinder, a patch of bent grass near the base of the tree, as though something heavy had recently passed through. He lowered the camera and stepped closer, careful not to disturb the area. The tracks were faint but unmistakable, broad paw prints pressed into the soft earth, the edges still crisp. Logan crouched down, tracing the pattern with his fingertips. They were larger than a cub's, but smaller than the mother bear's prints had been. He frowned, a prickle of unease crawling up his spine. Could there be another bear in the area? Or were these signs of the same family doubling back after their earlier encounter? He stood slowly, scanning his surroundings for movement, but the woods remained still. Pressing onward, Logan found himself hyper-aware of every sound and shadow. The forest seemed to close in around him, the once familiar trail now feeling like a labyrinth of possibilities and dangers. The sunlight grew dimmer as clouds rolled in overhead, casting a gray pall over the landscape. Logan quickened his pace, his instincts telling him that it was time to find shelter before the weather turned. The air carried a faint metallic tang, a telltale sign that rain was coming. His map indicated a small clearing with a rocky overhang a few miles ahead, and he resolved to reach it before the storm broke. The first raindrops began to fall as Logan crested a hill, their cold weight spattering against his jacket and dampening the ground beneath his boots. The forest transformed around him, the earthy scent of rain mingling with the sharp tang of pine. He pulled his hood up and pressed on, the trail growing slick and treacherous beneath his feet. By the time he reached the clearing, the rain had intensified into a steady downpour, the sound of water pounding against the leaves creating a constant, almost hypnotic rhythm. Logan ducked beneath the overhang, shrugging off his pack and leaning it against the dry rock wall. He exhaled deeply, the tension in his shoulders easing as he settled into the makeshift shelter. As he unpacked his gear, his thoughts drifted again to the bear cub. It was strange how vividly the encounter had imprinted itself on his mind. Every detail, the cub's small, trembling frame, The mother's silent scrutiny played back with a clarity that felt almost dreamlike. He wondered if the bears were safe, if the mother had found a more secure den to wait out the storm. Logan sighed, shaking his head. He had come here to escape the complexities of human life, but nature, it seemed, was no less intricate or enigmatic. The rain continued to fall as Logan built a small fire at the edge of the overhang, the warmth of the flames pushing back the damp chill that had seeped into his bones. He ate a simple meal of dried fruit and jerky, the quiet crackle of the fire, a soothing counterpoint to the storm outside. As the light began to fade, the rain eased into a gentle drizzle, and the forest seemed to exhale, its tension dissipating with the storm's retreat. Logan leaned back against the rock wall, watching as the firelight cast dancing shadows on the ground. His eyelids grew heavy, and soon he drifted into a restless sleep. In his dreams, the forest came alive in ways he couldn't explain. He saw the mother bear again, her amber eyes glowing like embers as she stood at the edge of the clearing. She didn't growl or move toward him. Instead, she simply watched, her gaze heavy with meaning. The dream shifted, and Logan found himself walking through a dense fog, the outlines of trees looming like specters around him. He felt the presence of something following him, silent, steady, and unyielding. When he turned, he saw not the bear, but the cub, its small form illuminated by an ethereal light. The cub's eyes locked onto his, and Logan woke with a start, his heart pounding. The fire had burned low, the embers glowing faintly in the pre-dawn light. Logan sat up, rubbing his eyes and trying to shake the lingering unease of the dream. He glanced toward the edge of the clearing and froze. In the soft gray light of morning, he saw movement, just a shadow slipping between the trees, but unmistakably there. For a long moment, he sat motionless, his breath caught in his throat. Then, as the shadow disappeared, he realized he was smiling. The forest, it seemed, wasn't done with him yet. The morning broke slowly, with the first rays of sunlight struggling to penetrate the dense canopy above. Logan Callahan stretched, his muscles stiff from a night spent on the hard ground beneath the rocky overhang. The forest around him was alive with the sounds of life shaking off the remnants of the storm. Raindrops clung to every leaf, sparkling like tiny jewels, and the air smelled clean and sharp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. Logan packed up his gear with methodical precision, his mind still heavy with the vivid dream that had pulled him from sleep. The image of the bear cub's glowing eyes lingered in his thoughts, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it meant something. Though what, he couldn't say. He had always prided himself on being logical, grounded in reality, but this trip had already challenged that notion. The wilderness had a way of stripping everything down to its raw essentials, and Logan was beginning to wonder if that included his sense of what was real and imagined. As he stepped onto the trail, Logan noticed how the storm had reshaped the forest. Small rivulets of water ran alongside the path, carving grooves in the dirt, and fallen branches littered the ground. He moved carefully, his boots squelching with each step. The air was cool and heavy with moisture, and the sunlight filtering through the trees painted the world in soft hues of green and gold. It felt like the forest was waking up with him, the chirping of birds and the distant rustle of leaves creating a symphony of quiet vitality. Logan adjusted his camera, taking a moment to capture the way the light danced on the droplets clinging to a fern. The shot felt insignificant compared to the images burned into his memory from the day before, but he took it anyway, feeling that each moment deserved its place. The trail led him uphill, the incline gentle but persistent. As he climbed, Logan began to notice subtle signs of movement in the woods around him. A flicker of brown darting through the underbrush, the faint sound of something larger shifting among the trees. He paused frequently, scanning his surroundings, but the forest offered no answers. There was no fear in him, though, only curiosity, a sense of being watched that felt less like a threat and more like a presence. It was as though the wilderness itself had taken an interest in him, its unseen inhabitants gauging his intentions. Logan's mind drifted to the legend of the protector bear he had overheard at the ranger station. It was a story dismissed by most as folklore, but standing there among the towering trees, he couldn't help but wonder, could there be some truth to it? The thought sent a shiver down his spine, a mix of wonder and unease. The path narrowed as it climbed, hemmed in by dense thickets of shrubs and young trees. Logan pushed through carefully, his arms brushing against leaves still slick with rain. The forest seemed darker here, the canopy thicker, letting in only scattered patches of light. The trail was fainter too, as though it had been forgotten by those who came before him. He stopped to consult his map, his finger tracing the route he had planned. According to the markings, he was nearing a small clearing, one that promised an unobstructed view of the surrounding mountains. The thought of standing in that open space, the vastness of the wilderness laid out before him, gave Logan a renewed sense of purpose. He folded the map and pressed on, his steps quickening despite the uneven terrain. When he reached the clearing, it was even more breathtaking than he had imagined. The forest opened abruptly, giving way to a grassy expanse bordered by jagged rocks. From here, the mountains stretched out in every direction, their peaks piercing the sky like ancient monuments. The valley below was a sea of green, dotted with patches of wildflowers that painted the landscape in bursts of color. Logan dropped his pack and he stood at the edge of the clearing, letting the wind tug at his hair and clothes. The feeling of insignificance that washed over him wasn't intimidating, it was freeing. He was just one small piece of a vast, interconnected whole, and in that moment, he felt a profound sense of belonging. Logan set up his camera, adjusting the angle and focus with practiced ease. He wanted to capture the way the sunlight bathed the mountains, the shadows creating depth and texture in the rugged terrain. As he framed the shot, a flash of movement caught his attention. He lowered the camera, his eyes scanning the edge of the clearing. At first, he saw nothing, but then it appeared, a large, dark shape moving slowly through the trees. His breath caught as the figure stepped into the open. It was a bear, but not the mother or cub he had encountered before. This one was larger, its fur darker, and its movements deliberate. Logan froze, his mind racing. He was far enough away that the bear posed no immediate threat, but the sight of it filled him with a mixture of awe and caution. The bear didn't seem to notice him. It wandered to the edge of the clearing, its nose low to the ground as it sniffed the air. Logan stayed perfectly still, his camera forgotten as he watched the animal. There was a grace to its movements, a power that seemed at odds with the gentleness of its exploration. After a moment, the bear raised its head, its gaze sweeping across the clearing. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, its eyes met Logan's. The bear held his gaze for what felt like an eternity before turning and ambling back into the trees. Logan exhaled, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt as though he had been judged, and for reasons he couldn't explain, accepted. The encounter left Logan shaken but exhilarated. He packed up his gear and resumed his journey, his thoughts swirling. This was more than a hike now. It was a dialogue with the wilderness, a conversation in which he was both participant and observer. The forest felt alive in a way he had never experienced, its mysteries unfolding around him with each step. He found himself more attuned to the subtle cues of the land, the rustle of leaves, the sudden stillness that signaled something unseen. Each sound and movement felt significant, as though the forest was speaking to him in a language he didn't yet understand. As the afternoon wore on, Logan reached another stream, its clear waters cutting a path through the rocks. He knelt to refill his bottle, the cold water refreshing against his hands. A small bird flitted to a nearby branch, its feathers bright against the muted tones of the forest. Logan watched it for a moment, marveling at the simplicity of its existence. The forest was full of such moments, tiny glimpses of life that felt monumental in their quiet beauty. Logan stood and slung his pack over his shoulder, his steps lighter now. He didn't know what awaited him further down the trail, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to face it. The wilderness was vast and unpredictable, but Logan no longer felt like an outsider. He was part of it now, and that was enough. The forest had grown denser, the trees pressing closer together as Logan Callahan continued along the narrowing trail. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, its golden light filtering through the canopy in fragmented beams that illuminated the moss-covered ground. Logan's steps were slower now, each one deliberate as he navigated the uneven terrain. The weight of his backpack was a familiar burden, grounding him as his thoughts drifted back to the bear he had seen at the clearing. Its gaze lingered in his mind, a quiet reminder that the wilderness was watching him as much as he was observing it. The bear had moved with such purpose, its presence commanding without aggression. Logan couldn't shake the feeling that these encounters were more than coincidences, as though the forest was trying to tell him something. He stopped at a bend in the trail where a fallen tree created a natural bench, its bark smooth from years of weathering. Setting his pack down, Logan retrieved a water bottle and took a long sip, savoring the coolness of it on his dry throat. The forest was alive with sound, the constant hum of insects punctuated by the occasional call of a bird or the rustle of unseen animals moving through the underbrush. Yet beneath the surface of these ordinary sounds, there was an energy that felt almost tangible, like an invisible thread connecting everything. Logan closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sounds wash over him. The rhythmic chorus of the woods was soothing, but it also carried a weight he couldn't ignore. He had come here seeking solitude and peace, but the wilderness was offering him something deeper, a challenge perhaps, or a question he had yet to understand. As Logan rose to his feet, a sudden movement caught his attention. He turned, scanning the trees, but whatever it was had already vanished. His heart quickened, and he found himself gripping the strap of his camera for reassurance. The forest around him was calm, the sunlight dappling the ground in golden patches. Yet Logan felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. It wasn't the predatory feeling that came with being stalked by a wild animal, but something subtler, more curious. He thought of the bear cub and its mother, of the lone bear in the clearing, and wondered if they were nearby, unseen but aware of his presence. The thought sent a shiver down his spine, equal parts exhilaration and unease. The trail descended steeply, leading into a valley where the trees grew taller and denser, their branches interwoven like the ribs of a great, living creature. The air here was cooler, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Logan noticed the silence first, an absence of birdsong and rustling that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The stillness was profound, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. He slowed his pace, his boots crunching softly against the ground, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet. As he moved deeper into the valley, the silence became oppressive, pressing against him like an unseen force. Logan's instincts screamed for caution, but he pressed on, drawn forward by something he couldn't name. The trail eventually opened into a small clearing, its edges framed by towering evergreens, whose roots twisted and gnarled like ancient hands. In the center of the clearing stood a single tree, its bark pale and smooth, glowing faintly in the muted light. Logan felt his breath catch as he stepped closer, drawn by the tree's quiet majesty. It was unlike any he had seen before, its branches spreading wide as though embracing the sky. The ground around it was soft and green, carpeted with moss that seemed to pulse faintly underfoot. Logan reached out a hand, his fingers brushing the bark. It was warm to the touch, a stark contrast to the cool air around him. A sense of calm washed over him, easing the tension in his shoulders and slowing the rapid beat of his heart. As he stood there, a sound broke the silence, a low, rhythmic rustling that seemed to come from all around him. Logan turned slowly, his eyes scanning the shadows at the edge of the clearing. At first he saw nothing, but then the figures emerged, one by one. Bears. They stepped into the clearing with deliberate grace, their movements silent despite their size. Logan counted 3, 2 adults and a smaller one trailing behind, its stubby legs wobbling slightly as it kept pace. His first instinct was to retreat, to put as much distance between himself and the animals as possible. But something in their demeanor stopped him. They didn't seem hostile or even wary. Instead, they moved with an air of quiet purpose, their dark eyes fixed on him. Logan stayed rooted to the spot, his breathing shallow as the bears approached. The largest of the 3, a massive male with a thick, dark coat, stopped a few yards away, lowering its head to sniff the air. Its eyes met Logan's, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold still. There was no fear in the bear's gaze, only a deep, ancient wisdom that made Logan feel small and insignificant in the best possible way. The other 2 bears stopped behind the first, their movements unhurried. The smaller one, a cub no older than a few months, peered curiously at Logan, its head tilting as though trying to make sense of him. Logan slowly lowered himself to one knee, his hands open at his sides to show he meant no harm. The bears didn't move closer, but they didn't retreat either. It was as if they were waiting, testing his reaction. The largest bear let out a low huff, a sound that rumbled through the clearing like distant thunder. Logan felt the vibrations in his chest, a primal resonance that seemed to bypass language entirely. He didn't know why, but he found himself nodding, as though acknowledging the bear's unspoken message. The tension in the air dissipated, and the bears turned, moving toward the pale tree in the center of the clearing. The cub lingered for a moment, its small, round eyes meeting Logan's, before it too followed the others. Logan stayed where he was, his knees pressing into the mossy ground, his heart pounding. He watched as the bears circled the tree, their movements slow and deliberate, almost reverent. It was a ritual, Logan realized, though its meaning was lost on him. When the bears finally retreated into the forest, disappearing as silently as they had come, Logan remained in the clearing, unable to move. The encounter had left him shaken, not from fear, but from a deep, overwhelming sense of awe. He felt as though he had been invited into a world far older and more complex than his own, a world where humans were not the center, but merely one thread in a vast, intricate tapestry. Slowly he stood, his legs trembling beneath him. The pale tree loomed before him, its branches swaying gently despite the still air. Logan reached out and touched its bark once more, feeling the warmth seep into his fingers. This time he didn't question it. Whatever this place was, it had accepted him. As he turned to leave, the silence lifted, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird. Logan stepped back onto the trail, his footsteps light. He didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it. The forest seemed alive in a way Logan Callahan had never experienced before. Every step along the winding trail was accompanied by a heightened awareness of his surroundings, as though the trees themselves were whispering in a language just beyond his comprehension. The pale tree in the clearing, the silent, deliberate movements of the bears, and the unshakable feeling of being observed had left a deep impression on him. The encounter replayed in his mind as he walked, each detail vivid and surreal, but undeniably real. The warmth of the tree's bark lingered on his fingertips, a phantom sensation that grounded him even as his thoughts spun. He didn't know what to make of it all, but he knew one thing: the forest had changed him. Or perhaps it was the other way around. As the trail descended into a valley, the air grew cooler, carrying with it the faint scent of whetstone and moss. Logan's boots crunched softly against the damp ground, the rhythm of his steps steady and deliberate. The light filtering through the canopy had taken on a softer, golden hue, casting long shadows across the forest floor. He glanced at his watch, noting that the afternoon was slipping into evening. It was time to find a place to make camp for the night. But the pull of the trail ahead kept him moving. Each turn, each rise and fall of the path promised something new, and Logan felt compelled to follow. The wilderness no longer felt like a backdrop for his exploration. It had become a living, breathing entity, guiding him deeper into its heart. Logan's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of water. At first, it was just a faint murmur, but as he continued, the noise grew louder, transforming into the unmistakable rush of a river. The trail led him to a ridge overlooking a wide expanse of shimmering water, its surface reflecting the fiery hues of the setting sun. The river twisted and turned through the landscape, bordered by rocky outcroppings and dense clusters of trees. Logan stood at the edge of the ridge, his breath catching at the sight. He had seen many rivers in his travels, but there was something different about this one. It felt ancient, its flow steady and unyielding, carving its way through the land as it had for centuries. Logan descended carefully, his hands gripping the rough bark of a tree for balance as the trail turned steep and uneven. When he reached the riverbank, he paused to take it all in. The water was clear, rushing over smooth stones with a melodic intensity that seemed to drown out all other sounds. He crouched by the edge, scooping a handful of the icy water to splash on his face. The cold was bracing, waking him from the haze of his thoughts. He knelt there for a moment, letting the chill seep into his skin before filling his water bottle and rising to his feet. Across the river, movement caught his eye. A deer stepped cautiously out from the trees, its delicate frame illuminated by the fading sunlight. Logan froze, his hand instinctively reaching for his camera. The deer's ears twitched, its large dark eyes scanning the riverbank. Logan moved slowly, raising the camera to his face and adjusting the focus. The shutter clicked softly as he captured the moment, the deer's silhouette framed against the golden light. He lowered the camera and watched as the animal bent its head to drink, its movements graceful and unhurried. The sight filled him with a quiet sense of peace, a reminder of the simple, unassuming beauty of the natural world. Logan turned his attention back to his surroundings, searching for a suitable spot to make camp. A cluster of large boulders near the riverbank caught his eye, their smooth surfaces offering a natural windbreak. He made his way over, setting down his pack and pulling out his gear. The process of setting up camp had become second nature to him, each action performed with practiced ease. He pitched his small tent between two boulders, its bright orange fabric a stark contrast to the earthy tones around it. Next, he gathered wood from the surrounding area, carefully selecting dry branches for his fire. The rhythmic motions of preparation were soothing, grounding him in the present moment. As the fire crackled to life, Logan leaned back against one of the boulders, the warmth of the flames chasing away the chill of the evening. The river's steady rush provided a constant backdrop, its sound blending with the crackling fire to create a symphony of nature. Logan unpacked a simple meal of instant noodles and jerky, the smell of the broth mingling with the smoke from the fire. He ate slowly, savoring the warmth of the food as the sky darkened above him. Stars began to emerge one by one, their light faint at first, but growing brighter as the last traces of daylight faded. Logan leaned back, his head resting against the cool stone, and stared up at the sky. The stars were unlike anything he could see in the city, their brilliance unspoiled by light pollution. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens, a river of light that mirrored the one rushing past him. Logan felt a profound sense of smallness, not in a way that diminished him, but in a way that connected him to something greater. The wilderness had stripped away all the distractions and noise of his daily life, leaving only the essentials. He thought about the bears again, about the pale tree and the strange, reverent way the animals had circled it. The forest was full of mysteries, ancient and unyielding, and for the first time, Logan felt like he was beginning to understand how little he truly knew. The fire burned low as the night deepened, its orange glow casting dancing shadows across the riverbank. Logan's eyelids grew heavy, but he resisted the pull of sleep, unwilling to let go of the moment just yet. The forest around him was alive with nocturnal sounds. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves as a small animal darted through the underbrush. The river's voice was steady, its rhythm unbroken, as though it had been flowing for eternity. Logan felt safe here, cocooned by the warmth of the fire and the vastness of the wilderness. It was a feeling he hadn't known he was searching for, but now that he had found it, he wasn't sure he could ever go back. When sleep finally claimed him, Logan's dreams were vivid and strange. He saw the pale tree again, its branches stretching toward the sky like arms in prayer. The bears were there too, their dark shapes moving silently through the clearing. This time, there were more of them, a whole gathering of creatures circling the tree in unison. Logan stood at the edge of the clearing, watching as the scene unfolded. He felt no fear, only a deep, inexplicable sense of belonging. The tree glowed faintly in the moonlight, its presence commanding and serene, and Logan understood without words that it was the heart of the forest, the source of its life and mystery. When Logan woke, the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and orange. The fire had burned out, leaving behind a pile of gray ash that smoldered faintly in the cool morning air. Logan sat up, his body stiff but his mind clear. The river still rushed beside him, unchanged and eternal, a reminder of the continuity of the world around him. As he packed up his camp and prepared to move on, Logan felt a quiet resolve settle over him. The forest still held its secrets, but he was no longer a stranger here. He was part of it now, and the journey ahead felt like a continuation of something far greater than himself. The morning air was crisp, biting against Logan Callahan's skin as he broke camp and secured his gear. The river beside him gurgled steadily, its sound a constant companion in the otherwise quiet wilderness. The soft hues of dawn bathed the forest in a golden light, dew sparkling on leaves and spiderwebs like scattered jewels. Logan paused, standing at the water's edge, letting the moment settle into his bones. It was these small, fleeting interactions with nature that had drawn him here. Yet now the pull felt deeper, more layered. He couldn't shake the sense that the forest was guiding him, weaving him into its rhythm with a purpose he had yet to uncover. Slinging his backpack over his shoulders, he stepped onto the trail, the damp earth yielding slightly beneath his boots. The terrain grew steeper as the trail snaked uphill, winding through a dense thicket of pines. The sun climbed higher, its warmth breaking through the lingering chill, though the shade from the trees kept the air cool. Logan moved steadily, his breathing controlled, his muscles finding their rhythm as the incline demanded focus. He found his mind wandering back to the dream from the night before, the image of the pale tree glowing faintly in the moonlight and the silent gathering of bears circling it. The memory felt too vivid, too precise to dismiss as mere imagination. It wasn't the first time he'd dreamed of the forest, but there was something different now, an urgency, as though the land itself was trying to communicate with him. Logan shook his head, trying to refocus on the present. He wasn't the type to dwell on omens or signs. Still, the thought lingered, nudging at the edges of his mind. As he crested the ridge, the forest opened up into a high meadow, the grass swaying gently in the breeze. Wildflowers in shades of blue, yellow, and white dotted the landscape, their colors vivid against the emerald expanse. Logan stopped to catch his breath, his eyes scanning the horizon. The meadow sloped downward toward a small, glimmering lake, its surface rippling slightly under the wind's touch. Beyond it, the jagged peaks of the mountains rose sharply, their snow-covered summits glinting in the sunlight. The sight was breathtaking, and Logan felt a familiar urge to capture it. He dropped his pack, pulling out his camera and adjusting the lens. The weight of the device in his hands was grounding, a tether to the world he could understand. As he clicked the shutter, the distant cry of an eagle echoed across the meadow, its call sharp and commanding. Logan lowered the camera, his eyes searching the sky until he spotted the bird circling high above. The eagle's movements were deliberate, its wings slicing through the air with practiced grace. Logan watched until it disappeared into the distance, a small dot swallowed by the vastness of the sky. He lingered in the meadow, drinking in the peace of the moment before continuing toward the lake. The trail narrowed, flanked by tall grasses that brushed against his legs. Insects buzzed lazily in the heat of the day, their hum blending with the soft rustle of the breeze. The closer Logan drew to the lake, the more he noticed subtle signs of wildlife. Tracks pressed into the soft earth, some deer, others smaller, like rabbits or foxes. A pile of freshly overturned soil caught his attention, likely the work of a foraging animal. He crouched to examine it, his fingers brushing the edges of the disturbed ground. The forest was alive with movement, even if much of it stayed hidden from view. Logan felt a quiet reverence settle over him, a sense of gratitude for being allowed to witness even these smallest traces of life. Reaching the lake, Logan set his pack down and knelt at the water's edge. The surface was clear, revealing smooth stones and darting fish beneath. He cupped his hands and splashed the cold water on his face, letting it drip down his neck and soak into his shirt. The refreshment was immediate, and he smiled faintly, the simple act a reminder of how little he needed to feel whole out here. He filled his water bottle, watching as ripples spread outward in concentric circles, disturbing the lake's perfect stillness. As he stood, movement on the far side of the lake caught his attention. At first, it was just a flicker of shadow, but then the figure emerged, a deer stepping cautiously from the tree line. It was smaller than the one he'd seen the previous evening, its movements tentative as it approached the water. Logan stayed perfectly still, not wanting to startle it. The deer lowered its head to drink, its slender legs poised to bolt at the first sign of danger. For a moment, Logan felt as though he and the deer were connected, both drawn to the lake's quiet sanctuary. The peace of the moment was interrupted by a sound that sent a jolt through Logan's chest. A sharp crack, like the snapping of a branch, followed by the faint rustle of something large moving through the trees. The deer's head shot up, its ears swiveling toward the noise. Logan turned toward the sound, his pulse quickening. The forest on the far side of the lake had grown still, the movement that had seemed constant moments ago now absent. The deer froze, its body tense, before bounding back into the cover of the trees. Logan's heart raced as he scanned the area, but whatever had made the noise remained unseen. He felt the weight of the silence, heavy and expectant, as though the forest was holding its breath. Logan backed away from the water, his eyes never leaving the tree line. He grabbed his pack and slung it over one shoulder, his mind racing through possibilities. A bear? A large predator? The forest was full of life, but not all of it was harmless. He moved slowly, retreating toward the trail without turning his back on the woods. The sense of being watched returned, stronger now, a prickling sensation at the back of his neck. Logan's breath came faster, his chest tightening as the silence dragged on. Just as he reached the edge of the meadow, the sound came again. A crack, closer this time, followed by a low, resonant growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Logan froze, his body instinctively lowering into a crouch as he searched the shadows for movement. The growl was unmistakable, deep and guttural, the kind of sound that triggered primal fear. And then he saw it, a massive shape emerging from the trees, its dark fur blending with the shadows. The bear was larger than any he'd seen before, its sheer size both awe-inspiring and terrifying. It stepped into the open, its head low, its movements slow and deliberate. Logan's heart thundered in his chest as he fought the urge to run. Instead, he stayed still, his instincts screaming at him to remain calm. The bear stopped several yards away, its dark eyes locking onto his. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the air between them charged with a tension that felt almost alive. Logan raised his hands slowly, palms out, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his words trembling. The bear huffed, its breath visible in the cool air, before turning and disappearing back into the trees. Logan exhaled sharply, his body shaking as the tension released. Whatever had just passed between them, he didn't understand it, but he knew without a doubt that the forest was far from finished with him. The forest had quieted once again, but Logan Callahan's heart remained a drumbeat of adrenaline, its echo coursing through him as he stood frozen at the edge of the meadow. The encounter with the bear had left him rattled, though it was not fear that lingered most. It was awe. There had been a moment, however brief, when the massive creature's gaze had held his, and in that instant, Logan had felt something shift inside him. It wasn't just the raw power of the animal or its commanding presence. It was the undeniable sense that the bear had made a choice to let him go. Logan breathed deeply, his fingers trembling as he adjusted the straps of his pack. The forest was not merely a place to be visited, observed, or even revered. It was alive, aware, and it had allowed him to remain within its depths. The sun dipped lower as Logan resumed his journey, his steps cautious but steady. He followed the trail as it wound downhill, each turn revealing another glimpse of the wilderness unfolding before him. Shadows stretched long across the ground, and the golden light of dusk painted the landscape in hues of amber and crimson. Logan's mind churned with thoughts he couldn't quite articulate, fragments of understanding brushing against him like the rustle of leaves in a passing breeze. He had come into the wilderness seeking solitude, peace, and perhaps even escape. But what he had found was something far greater. He felt as though he had become a part of the forest fabric, a thread woven into its intricate and ancient design. As he walked, the trees began to thin, their branches giving way to an expansive clearing bathed in the warm glow of twilight. In the center of the clearing stood the pale tree, its luminous bark glowing faintly in the fading light. Logan stopped in his tracks, his breath catching. He hadn't expected to see it again, not so soon, and yet there it was, as though waiting for him. The air felt heavier here, charged with an energy that sent a shiver down his spine. Slowly he approached the tree, each step deliberate, his boots crunching softly against the mossy ground. The forest around him was silent, as though holding its breath. When Logan reached the tree, he extended a hand, his fingers hovering just above the smooth bark. The warmth he had felt before radiated from it again, a gentle heat that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. As his palm made contact, a wave of calm washed over him, easing the tension in his shoulders and filling his chest with a quiet, profound sense of connection. The tree was not just alive, it was vibrant, its presence humming with the life force of the forest itself. Logan closed his eyes, letting the sensation envelop him, his breathing slowing to match the tree's subtle rhythm. A soft, rustling sound broke the silence, and Logan's eyes snapped open. He turned to see a bear emerging from the shadows at the edge of the clearing. It was the same massive figure he had encountered near the lake, its dark fur blending with the encroaching dusk. The bear moved with deliberate grace, its movements neither threatening nor timid. Logan held his ground, his pulse quickening as the animal approached. Behind it, more shapes materialized. Other bears, their forms smaller but no less commanding. They stepped into the clearing one by one until a group of 6 had gathered, their dark eyes reflecting the faint glow of the pale tree. Logan stood motionless, his breath shallow, as the bears formed a loose circle around him. The largest bear, the one that had first appeared, moved closer, stopping just a few paces away. It let out a low, rumbling huff, a sound that vibrated through the air and resonated in Logan's chest. He didn't move, his instincts screaming at him to remain still. The bear's gaze locked onto his, deep and knowing, as if it were searching for something within him. Logan felt exposed, as though the animal could see every fear, doubt, and hope he carried. And then slowly, the bear lowered its massive head, its posture shifting from one of dominance to something almost reverent. The other bears followed suit, their great forms bowing toward the tree in a silent, unified gesture. Logan's breath caught as he realized what he was witnessing. This was no ordinary gathering of animals. It was a ritual, a moment steeped in purpose and significance. The bears were not just guardians of the forest, they were its soul, its protectors, bound to the land in ways he could only begin to understand. He felt humbled, small in the presence of such ancient wisdom, but also deeply honored. The forest had accepted him, allowed him to bear witness to this sacred moment, and in doing so, it had entrusted him with a responsibility he couldn't yet define. The largest bear lifted its head and let out a deep, resonant growl that echoed through the clearing. The sound was not one of aggression, but of command, a declaration that seemed to ripple through the very air. The other bears rose in unison, their movements fluid and deliberate. One by one, they turned and retreated into the forest, their dark shapes melting into the shadows. The largest bear lingered, its gaze lingering on Logan for a moment longer before it, too, disappeared into the trees. Logan stood alone in the clearing, the pale tree's glow casting faint patterns on his skin. The silence that followed was profound, the weight of the moment pressing against him like a hand on his shoulder. Logan sank to the ground, his legs trembling as he tried to process what he had seen. The forest felt alive around him, its energy wrapping around him like a blanket. He didn't know how long he sat there staring at the tree as the sky darkened above him. Stars began to emerge, their light faint at first but growing stronger as night settled in. Logan felt a sense of peace unlike anything he had ever known. The forest had given him a gift, one that went beyond words or images. It had reminded him of his place in the world, of the delicate balance between humanity and nature, and of the importance of protecting what was sacred. When he finally stood, the moon had risen high above the trees, its light bathing the clearing in a silvery glow. Logan took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. He didn't know what lay ahead or how he would honor the bond he now felt with the forest, but he knew he couldn't return to the life he had lived before. The wilderness had changed him, not just in the way it made him see the world, but in the way it made him see himself. He was no longer just an observer, capturing fleeting moments with his camera. He was a participant, a protector, and a witness to something far greater than himself. Logan stepped back onto the trail, his footsteps lighter now, his heart steady. The pale tree glowed softly behind him, a beacon in the darkness. As he disappeared into the forest's embrace, the wilderness stretched out before him, vast and unknowable. But for the first time, Logan felt ready. He was not alone. The forest was with him, and together they would face whatever came next.